Okay, with that, we're going to move on to Chair Lee with House File 3582. Welcome to the committee, Chair Lee. I will move that House File 3582 be recommended to be re-referred to capital investment. And with that, would you like to speak to your amendment first or discuss the bill first?
Why don't I discuss the bill first, and then we can move on to the amendment, Madam
Awesome.
Chair.
If you'll begin, please.
All right, thank you, members, for the opportunity to present House File 3582. This is a bill that I wanted to bring forward, after having traveled the state for the last 3 biennium as a member of the Capital Investment Committee. And so just for background for all of you, over the years, I think the requests from local units of government and state agencies have increased. Just to provide some background, when MMB came and presented before the Capital Investment Committee, in 2020, just perspective for all of you, state request was around $3.7 billion. Local projects was about 1.3. And then, this year has got to 4.7 billion for state agencies and almost 3 billion for local units of government. And so I think that, it's critical for us to have this conversation on how do we address our assets, whether that's at the state or local units of government going forward. And just wanted to, I think just let you know the context for our state assets. Right now there's a deferred maintenance backlog of $6.4 billion. And so I think that as we hear and see on the tours, a lot of the local communities that are coming before us, we are at the end of the useful life of when these infrastructure were put in. And so we have this discussion on how do we really help these local communities move forward, but at the same time plan for the long term and actually make sure that they could take care of their own assets too, and not just come back 20, 30, 40 years from now for state assistance again for the same project. And so what I'm proposing in this bill is to require local units of government and nonprofits in the DE amendment to establish a replacement account to address some of the future needs that we may see. And this is not a new program or concept that I'm proposing here. We're currently doing this for the water infrastructure funding program. And, I think this proposal is also in line with the best practices that's adopted by the Government Finance Officers Association to establish capital asset renewal and replacement reserve policies to help governments manage their investment in capital improvements and to give them tools to optimize their assets and for replacement. And so the DE2 amendments require any grantee receiving appropriation of state money for capital projects subject to Chapter 16 to establish the account for major rehabilitation, expansion, or replacement of the capital projects. And after hearing some feedback from people who are interested in this, we also had an exception or an allowance for other capital projects that the grantee may own, so that this account could be used for other capital projects. And then we also have that a grantee must adopt a capital project replacement policy that specifies the following: the risk to be mitigated or managed by the fund, the intended use of the replacement fund, including but not limited to how the fund will be used for major rehabilitation, expansion, or replacement of the capital project, and criteria for the use of the fund to address other capital improvement needs of the grantee, including safety and security, maintenance and utility costs, availability of repair parts and materials, sustainability, and any other criteria the grantee deems relevant. Subdivision 2, the Commissioner of MMB must determine the annual minimum deposits amount into the fund by capital project type. The Commissioner must take into account depreciation, construction costs, inflation, and other relevant factors when determining the minimum deposit amounts. Subdivision 3, the state auditor may audit capital project replacement accounts as part of the regular audits of local government. And then Subdivision 4 is the exemption for projects that already require replacement fund, which is in the WIF statute. And then Subdivision 5 is a penalty for failure to comply is equal to 1% of the appropriations of the state money for the capital projects for each year of the non-compliance, and penalty fees will be deposited into the general fund. And so, Madam Chair, with that, covered the DE2 amendment.
Thank you. Members, do you have, I just want to make sure I made a motion that we had the DE2 before us. So we do have a motion for the DE2. I move with that amendment. Members, do you have any discussions regarding the DE2? Representative Nadeau.
On the DE2, Chair Lee, Madam Chair, my question has to do with line 1.21, 1.22. Why are we exempting the state from this requirement? It seems to be okay for local gov, but we're going to exempt the state. Why would we do that? Does the state already collect adequate money to replace all of its assets, so we don't need to include them?
Chair Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative. The state comes to the Capital Investment Committee with their capital budget request for us to consider for funding.
Representative Nadeau.
And thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for that. That's exactly what local units of government do. They have a CIP. They basically, they levy using ad valorem taxes or revenue resources. They literally budget those things as well. So once again, is it because the legislature is because I'm trying to think of how we're so much better as an adjudicator of capital and replacement funds versus a local unit of government. I'm still wondering why we're exempting the state from this important concept.
Representative Nadeau, am I hearing you wanting to put more money into the Asset Preservation Reserve Fund?
What's good for the goose is good for the gander, Madam
Thank you.
Chair.
Thank you, Representative Nadeau. Chair Lee, do you have any comments?
Thank you for that, Madam Chairman. Thank you, Representative. I think that this is an idea and a concept that I do want to explore with our state agencies too.
Right. And Chair Lee, I just want to thank you for your willingness to work with me on this legislation and your willingness to continue conversations regarding this legislation. Representative Nash.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chair Lee, you and I have talked about this as recent as yesterday on the floor. I guess my question is still, how is this going to impact small cities and their ability to put together, we'll just call it a CIP, for lack of a better term. Everybody kind of understands that if you've been in municipal government. How are they going to handle creating a fund for the maintenance of, let's say, a water treatment plant or a water tower or whatever, when at the moment they may not even have the ability to put together enough money for the project, which is why they're coming to talk about bonding. I shared some local examples that both Representative Harder and I share and others share, and I'm just worried that this is going to make it so that those cities or counties or whatever couldn't even receive bonding if they're not able to put together the maintenance on their projects.
Representative Nash, before we go on with the answer to your question, we still have testimonies. We're not into the full discussion of the bill. We need to adopt the DE2. May we move with that motion first?
Well, I think the question is germane to the adoption of the amendment, so I
right.
prefer if we could get an answer to that.
Chair Lee.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Representative Nash, for the questions. And, after that discussion, I did reach out to the PFA, who currently administer a similar program. And to date, they are working with small communities for water infrastructure funds. And I asked them, are there any compliance issue? And there aren't. And so I think that, just using that as a model, we're going to hear some concerns. And I think that that's why I'm willing to work with everybody that's interested in this, so that when we, go through the process of whether that's setting up the minimal amounts or whatnot, that we actually work with our state agencies to make sure that communities are not going to be impacted financially with this. And I think that some of the examples that we're even seeing from the memos that, like from the League of Minnesota Cities or whatnot, is that communities right now have the ability to charge a fee for whatever type of infrastructure, and maybe that could be set aside for the reserve. And so, this is an ongoing conversation. We're going to address this as this moves through the Capital Investment Committee process too. And so for any members who are interested in this, I'm more than willing to work with this to make sure that communities will not be negatively impacted, but with the foresight that we do need to plan for the long term so that the state could address our responsibility, which are the state assets.
Right. And having heard from the minority lead on this committee on the DE2, we are going to move to a vote for adoption of the DE2. All those in favor of adoption, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed, say nay.
No.
Hearing the motion prevails. The bill is now in the order that you would like. If we can move to testimony, if you're all right with that. I would like to call forward Mr. Craig Johnson from the League of Minnesota Cities. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. If you'd please state your name for the record and begin your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I'm Craig Johnson with the League of Minnesota Cities. League of Minnesota Cities is the state association representing 838 of the 855 cities in the state. The 18 that aren't members, or 17 that aren't members now, are all under 200 in population, and we still answer the phone if they call. Very much appreciate the opportunity to make a few quick comments here, and am very grateful for the time that Chair Lee has spent in discussing this with us over the last week or so here. The DE2 amendment does reflect a number of the issues we discussed in earlier dialogue. I'm going to stick to the DE2, not talk about the history of what has changed, and only talk about what is in the DE2 in front of you right now. So to start off with, just a reminder, and the reference to it did come up, cities already do capital improvement planning. That's a major part of what cities do, is decide how much money in their levy they can set aside for purposes of capital projects they're going to need to do. When they come to the state is when it's determined that that's not going to be enough, or it's a project that is outside of the scope of what they are putting money away for. And so that's where we end up coming to the state with these increasingly expensive proposals of things that need to be done at the local level, asking for the state to be a partner in that. Usually the state is a partner in that, does not fund the whole project, only funds part of it. The changes in the DE2 amendment are very helpful in that they lead this away from, as much as I can tell, I do need to do a little more work on what the 16A reference encompasses for types of projects. But once we understand that, the intent, I know, has been to take funds that already have either repayment as part of getting the money, so like the revolving loan accounts that we use for infrastructure, or grant funds that do have some sort of replacement requirement, like the Water Infrastructure Grants Program, and not have that. This is not meant to, as I understand it, apply to those sorts of projects and those sorts of funding sources. On the first section, however, I do want to point out that there is no mechanism in here that limits what liability a community would have for repayment or putting money aside based on how much money they got from the state. So maybe you got funding for half of your project from the state. This does not say so then you would only be responsible for putting aside a certain lesser threshold. You would have to still put aside the full replacement cost of that project over the course of the funding for there to be an opportunity for you to get funding for half of it up front. I do think that that doesn't feel like it works quite right and would be a very major disadvantage for especially communities that are having a hard time getting the money in the first place. And I do think that there are still some more exceptions that we're going to need under subdivision 4. There are emergency and disaster responses. There is some allowance to put that in your plan in this, but it doesn't make it very clear that that would have to be accepted by MMB as part of the plan. And time delays in getting access to those funds could also be a challenge. But very much appreciate the language that the author has put in to try and get some of that discussed up front in the plan, the way the bill is crafted right now. Overall, Madam Chair, we still have concerns with how this would work. The Water Infrastructure Grants Program that was referenced as a place where this works does not require full replacement funding to be put aside. It requires that utility rates be set at a sufficient level to maintain the facility and deal with expected upkeep and maintenance, but they still likely would need to come back for new funding when that project wears out. Over 20 years, the cost of a project easily doubles, and with, at least with the projects I tend to work on environment issues, water and wastewater and stormwater and other issues like that, the technology and the environmental regulations increase dramatically over any 20-year window that we've looked at recently. So if If we can continue to work on this, I hope we can get some of those issues addressed as we work in the capital investment program and further, and I'm happy to keep working with the author on those issues. Very much appreciated.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson, and I think you just touched the heart of the issue. We want infrastructure that's been paid for to be maintained so that we have the opportunity to have the full life capacity of that infrastructure. Members, are there any questions? Representative Nadeau.
I've lots of questions.
Well, let's keep it to the bill itself.
And I'm going to keep it to the DE. I mean, the bill's
The
changed.
bill as amended.
Yep, yep. So it's changed. You know, this is going to make it more difficult for cities to move forward and partner with state government. It's going to impose additional and higher taxes, not knowing whether or not the city is going to make in 20 years a decision to replace that infrastructure or build new infrastructure. I'm glad that you changed the language. I'm glad that you amended the language. I think that's great. I think it really goes in the right direction. Because before, giving a commissioner the ability to almost set ad valorem taxes was really out there. So I really appreciate this. But this is not. We have, as a legislature and as the chair of Capital Finance, you have the ability to evaluate those projects that people bring forward. I'd be the first one to say that we bring far too many projects forward for state funding. And, you know, maybe we should hone in and really try to prioritize.
Representative Nadeau, is there a question?
There is.
Okay.
We'd really try to hone in, you know, what we want to fund. So my question specifically is, what value do you think this provides to either the state legislature or local units of government by enacting this legislation? What value is out there?
Firstly, I'd like to thank Mr. Johnson for his testimony and excuse him from the dais. Chair Lee.
Thank you, Chair. And, you know, I think that's a really good question, I think, for us to decide as a legislature on what should be included in a capital budget bill or not. And, you know, like I mentioned to the stakeholders, I think that there's members on both sides of the aisles that don't think that we should fund any local projects at all. And, you know, for me, as the capital budget chair at this moment in time, I believe that, you know, communities are coming to us and they do need help. And so why don't we step in and provide that help? But this is one avenue to help us ensure that we are planning for the future so that communities actually have a plan to fix the asset that we're putting money into so that we could continue to help out those other communities throughout the entire state that still needs help. And if you go back to my earlier remarks, we went from, you know, 1.4 last year now to 2.9, over 100% increase in requests, and we're going to continue to have that. And so without taking any kind of action, whether it's this or not, we're going to see those amounts come in, and, you know, we will have tougher decisions to make as a body. And so I think what I'm trying to get at with this proposal is that this is one option for us to consider as we plan for the future, that we help you right now. We really want you to have a plan to address your assets. And, you know, what we just heard from Mr. Johnson, I think that 20 years, they're going to come back for more funding. And so is that something that we as a body want to continue to do? You know, not, maybe we probably won't be here, but I think that's for future legislature decides. And so I want us to start thinking about how do we plan for asset management going forward.
Thank you, Chair Lee. Further questions? Representative Bonner.
Less of a question and more of a comment, and I just want to say I realize that there's clearly some details to be worked through here. And so, but I wanted to commend you for bringing this forward and thinking about this. I want to thank my grandmother for being a very conservative woman who liked to squirrel away money all over the place as a contingency. But one of the things that I hear very commonly in my community, and particularly from our more conservative members in my community, I live in a very purple district, is a question about why we don't do more to set aside money to maintain the assets we have, and why we're constantly being barraged by requests to raise local tax dollars to pay for projects that many of my citizens have said, why didn't we plan for that? And I do know that we do that on some level, but very likely not to the level we should. And so I really appreciate you exploring this idea of how we be good stewards of the money that we invest in our communities and how we maintain those assets. So I'm thankful to you, Chair Lee.
And with that, Shirley, is there any further comments you'd like to make?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and just to, reaffirm that, I'm willing to work with whoever is interested in this. I think to date, haven't really seen any, actual language to make sure that we could address some of the concerns going forward. And so I'm more than willing to work with any members on here who's interested or outside groups who are interested in this issue.
Thank you. And with that, I will renew my motion that House File 3582, as amended, be re-referred to the Capital Investment Committee. All of those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? No. Motion prevails. House File 3582, as amended, is re-referred to the Capital Investment Committee.